Hi students, welcome to lesson number 16 on untouchability, its forms and perspectives. Untouchability is one of the major age-old problems of our country with manifold social, economic and political implications. It has its roots in the Indian society that is based on the caste system. The castes are further divided into subcastes. The people of the lowest caste are treated as untouchables. They do not belong to the fold of Hinduism. Nobody knows exactly about the origin of untouchability or the caste system itself. The PurusaSukta in the Rig Veda describes the creation of 4 Varnas, namely the Brahmin, the Kshatriya, the Vaishya and the Shudra. The indigenous people were outside the Varna system. They continued to fight against the invading Aryans, but they were subjugated in the long run. In order to preserve the purity of blood, social interaction was prohibited with the members of the defeated group. Those who did not follow the rule or violated it were forced to live away from the dominating group. Such people became outcasts and later untouchables. Untouchability is a social phenomena which was the matter of concern of every person or leader, mainly during the freedom struggle. The Constitution for the first time in 1850 provided an infrastructure of the law which not only abolished untouchability and punished those who practice untouchability. Millions of Dalits across the country, who account for roughly 1/5 of the population, continue to suffer birth-based discrimination and humiliation. The students will be able to understand what is untouchability, its origins, its forms and causes. They will also understand the theories which explain untouchability. Now, who are untouchables? Untouchables are those whose occupations and habits of life involved ritually polluting activities, of which the most important were: first one, taking life for a living, a category that included, for example, fishermen. Second, killing or disposing of dead cattle or working with their hides for a living. Third, doing activities that brought the person into contact with emissions of the human body, such as feces, urine, sweat and spittle, and occupations such as manual scavengers, sweepers and eating the flesh of cattle. Now, what is the definition and nature of untouchability? Untouchability in its literal sense is a practice of ignoring a minority group by segregating them from the mainstream by social custom or legal mandate. The term untouchability is mostly commonly used for Dalits or scheduled caste who were considered polluting. According to B.R. Ambedkar, untouchability is a notion of defilement, pollution and contamination. It is a case of permanent hereditary stain which nothing can cleanse. He theorized that untouchability origin because of the deliberate policy of the upper caste Brahmins. Dr. D.N. Majumdar, the untouchables caste are those who suffer from various social and political disabilities, many of which are traditionally prescribed and socially enforced by higher caste. Untouchability as a social concept has become embodied in customs, and as customs differ, so does untouchability. The classes which are commonly regarded as untouchables are Chamas, Busat, Dom, Halalkor, Hari, Mochi, Mushashar, although they were outside the pole of Hindu society, which recognizes only 4 classes, namely Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas and Shudras. They were reckoned as part of the Hindu society for political purposes. Before the Indian Constitution that abolished untouchability in 1950, the untouchables were divided into 3 categories, namely untouchables, unapproachable and unseenable. The untouchables had different names in different parts of the country. They were called outcastes. Untouchables, namely Paryas, Panchamas, Atishudras, Avarnas, Antyajas and Nama Shudras. Their touch and even voice were deemed by the caste Hindus to be polluting. So, they had to clear the way at the approach of a caste Hindu. Now we will understand how untouchability originated, or what is the origin of untouchability. Untouchability originated in India around AD 400, and it arose out of the struggle for supremacy between Buddhism and Brahminism. During the pre-independence era, the term depressed class was used to denote the untouchables. This was replaced by scheduled caste in 1935, when these castes were placed on a schedule as qualifying for special right. Gandhiji used the term Harijan for untouchable, dates from his 1933-34 campaigning against untouchability. The origin of untouchability is a problem, and it is held that it is a perverted outcome of the caste system. The Vedic Aryans knew no caste system. The Aryans divided themselves for different occupations of labor and according to aptitude, liking and the capacity of the individual. So, those who took to learning were called Brahmins, those who undertook governance were classified as Kshatriyas, those who resorted to trade were termed Vaishyas, and those who served the upper three classes were known as Shudras. Brahmins continued to be regarded as someone next to God, whereas a man from the lowest class as a Shudra. In this way, the four Varnas came to stay as four castes. Henceforth, different professions, barriers of provinces, varying ways of living, different superstitions and customs broke up the main four castes and further led to the creation of various subcastes. The untouchables were from the lower strata of the Hindu society and were condemned as untouchables by the caste Hindus down the centuries. Untouchability is part of practice of Hinduism. It is a notion of defilement, contempt and hatred towards a section of people called untouchables. It is observed by almost all the orthodox caste Hindus throughout the country. As a mental attitude, it is manifested through several acts which include denial of temple entry, denial to access to drinking water, restriction to use jewelry and finery, refuse to admit in educational institutions, hospitals, hostels, hotels, social boycott, obstruction to exercise any right or claim, insult and molestation of untouchables, compulsion to do some acts such scavenging and perpetration of atrocities on the untouchables as a reprisal or revenge for having exercised their legitimate rights. The caste which suffers following restrictions are considered as untouchables. First one, inability to be served by twice born or Brahmins. Second, inability to be served by barbers, water carriers, tailors, etc., who serve the caste Hindus. Third, inability to serve water to caste Hindus. Fourth, inability to enter temples. Fifth, inability to use public properties such as wells, bore wells, schools, shops, etc. Sixth, inability to disassociate oneself from a despised occupation. Now, we will understand the various theories on origin of untouchability, and the first theory is the racial theory of untouchability. The origin of untouchability can be traced back to the time when the Aryans invaded India around 1500 BC. The Aryans looked down upon the indigenous people as culturally and racially inferior. Among the indigenous people, some of them disappeared in the jungles and the rest of them were subdued and incorporated into Aryan society as inferior caste. The people who escaped into jungles were considered as Chandals in the later Vedic period. There was lots of stigma against the Chandals, but untouchability appeared on a large scale between 600 BC to 200 AD. In ancient Indian history, we often come across four races, namely the Aryans, Dravidians, Dasas and Nagas. The word Dravidia is a language and not the race of the people. It was a language of the Nagas throughout India. The most important thing to note here is that the contact between the Aryans and the Nagas and the effect it produced on the Nagas and the language. The effect of this contact on the Nagas of North India was quite different from the effect it produced on the Nagas of South India. The Nagas in the North India gave up Dravidiya, which was their mother tongue, and adopted Sanskrit in its place. The Nagas in South India spoke Tamil, Dravidiya, as their mother tongue and did not adopt Sanskrit, the language of the Aryans. It is important to note here that why the name Dravidiya came to be applied only for the people of the South India. And the reason is that the Nagas of North India ceased to speak the Dravidiya language, whereas only the Nagas of the South India kept speaking Dravidiya. This is the real reason why the people of South India came to be called as Dravidians. It is a fact that the terms Dravidiya and Nagas are merely two different names for the same people. Nagas was a racial or cultural name and Dravidiya was a linguistic name. In other words, it can be said that there have been at the most only two races, namely the Nagas and the Aryans. The implications of this theory is that the Dravidians were conquered by the Aryans and were made untouchables. Thus, the untouchables were among the original tribes of South India who became isolated from the rest of the world and so were looked down by others. Now, the occupational theory on untouchability. According to occupational theory, untouchability is to be found in the unclean and filthy occupations of the untouchables. This theory is very plausible one. These filthy and unclean occupations which the untouchables perform are common to all human societies. In every human society, there are people who perform these occupations. It is important to note that such people were not treated as untouchables in other parts of the world. According to the theory, there are two types of occupations, pure work and impure work. Impure work is done by slaves, example, sweeping the village, the gateway, the road and the place for rubbish, gathering and putting away the leftover food and urine and cleaning toilets. On the other hand, laborers do pure work. People involved with polluted or impure work are treated as untouchables. But this theory is criticized, saying that Aryans could be a slave of an Aryan. No matter to what Varna an Aryan belonged to, he could be a slave. A Kshatriya could be a slave and even Vaishya could be a slave. To put it in a concrete form, in the Varna system, Brahmin could have a Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra as his slave. A Kshatriya could have Kshatriya, a Vaishya and a Shudra as his slave. In the same way, a Vaishya could have a Vaishya and a Shudra as his slave. A Shudra could have a Shudra only. Thus, the law of slavery remained and all Aryans, whether they were Brahmins or Kshatriyas, Vaishyas or Shudras, they could not be made slaves. This change in the law of slavery did not make any difference regarding the duties prescribed for the slaves. This means that if a Brahmin, Kshatriya or Vaishya was a slave, he had to do the work of a scavenger. Only a Brahmin did not do scavenging in the house of a Kshatriya, Vaishya or a Shudra, but he would do scavenging in the house of a Brahmin. Similarly, a Kshatriya would do scavenging in the house of a Brahmin, and the Kshatriya, he would not do it only in the house of a Vaishya or a Shudra. A Vaishya would do scavenging in the house of a Brahmin, Kshatriya and Vaishya. He would not do it only in the house of a Shudra. It is therefore obvious that all the four castes who are admittedly the Aryans did the work of scavenging, which is the filthiest of filthy occupations. Thus, the theory of filthy occupation as an explanation of untouchability is therefore not acceptable. Now, we will understand what are the causes of untouchability. The major cause of untouchability is the caste system. Those who belong to the caste of the untouchables were the most degraded amongst Hindus. The hierarchical order of the caste system makes a difference between the member of the higher caste and the untouchables. The prevalence of taboos in the caste system are the causes of untouchability. As there are the taboos for the higher caste regarding intermarrying, eating and mixing with lower caste, similarly taboos were created for prevention, touching and even seeing of the lower caste who do menial or dirty work. Apart from caste system, according to J.H. Hutton, there are three fundamental causes of untouchability, that is the racial causes, religious causes and social causes. Now, what are the racial causes? Race is the fundamental causes of untouchability. A large number of races existed in India, but the Aryans, who were advanced and civilized people, defeated the indigenous people of India. Since the Aryans became victorious, they subjected the vanquished to all sorts of humiliation. Those who were considered inferior from the point of view of race later on became untouchables and inferior in many respects. The racial distinction is responsible for the origin of the custom of untouchability in yet another way. It is told that the Aryans, after defeating the aboriginals, gradually proceeded towards the south, where they faced the problem of getting life partners. But due to dearth of women from their own race, some of them got married to the Dasyu girls. Those who married Dasyu girls were kept away from the other Aryans, and restrictions were imposed on them in respect of commensality and connubium. As a result, in course of time, the entire system became very rigid, and such people began to be treated as untouchables. In fact, the untouchability has its roots in the racial factors, and has rightly said by Dr. D. N. Majumdar that the disabilities of the so-called depressed castes are not ceremonial, but probably found on racial and cultural itself. Now, what are the religious causes? Religious beliefs constituted another cause of untouchability. Purity and divinity have been given important place in religion. These were considered essential in motivating people to keep away from engaging in impure occupations. As Ghure writes, ideas of purity and pollution, whether occupational or ceremonial, are found to have been the factors in the genesis of caste, are the very soul of the idea and the practice of untouchability. Thus, because they were following occupations like manual scavenging, cobblers, removing of carcasses, cleaning dry toilets, and so on, were looked upon as inferior group, contact with whom was defiling, and thus were required to live in a separate colony outside the village. Ghure believed that idea of purity and impurity gave birth to untouchability. Now, what are the social causes of untouchability? Hutton is of the opinion that origin of the system is partly racial, religious, and partly a matter of social custom. Social custom and conventions are equally significant in maintaining untouchability. Aryan was responsible for maintaining commensality and restriction on social intercourse. Ghure has maintained that the desire of the upper caste to remain pure caused untouchability. Social conventions are so strong and influential that even the members of the untouchable community dare not defy or violate the custom of untouchability. The untouchables were not allowed to enter into temples and also were forbidden to draw water from common wells. Similarly, in some parts of the country, they were not allowed to wash their clothes in the daytime. Now, we will try to understand what are the various forms of untouchability practices. Untouchability can be observed in actual behavior, ideas, beliefs, and in the feelings of individuals. It is observed that in contemporary times, the practice of untouchability has modified itself to become subtle. This might differ according to the demographic or social characteristics of individuals, or they may be uniform. It also happens that the same root might not be observed in another situation. Individuals of different groups might not always observe untouchability in the same situations. Now, what are the views of Gandhi on untouchability? Gandhiji helped and strived for the upliftment of the untouchables. This was the period when the untouchables themselves were on a warpath and were engaged in offering their civic and social rights. During this period, the untouchables of Bombay Presidency had launched their satyagraha at Mahad for establishing their right to take water from the public tank, and at Nasik for establishing their right to enter a Hindu temple. Gandhiji argued that untouchability was a sin of the Hindus. It is the Hindus who must start satyagraha for the removal of untouchability. Satyagraha was not the business of the untouchables because they were not sinners of it. When asked about the declaration about the removal of untouchability, Gandhiji replies that the untouchables are a part of a whole. I am working for the whole, and I therefore believe that for the untouchables who are part of the whole. Mahatma Gandhi wanted to eliminate untouchability. He called the untouchables Harijan, or the children of God. He organized satyagraha at various places to provide them entry into temples and access to public wells, tanks, roads and schools. He wanted to tell upper caste people that cleaning work is not an undignified work, and for this he cleaned toilets himself to dignify the work of the manual scavengers and sweepers. He tried to persuade the upper caste to change their heart against the evils of untouchability. Now, what are the views of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar on untouchability? Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, in his book The Untouchables, Who Were They and Why They Become Untouchables, which was published in the year 1948, has described the origin of untouchables and their emergence in Hindu and non-Hindu society. He claimed that Manusmriti of Manu is responsible for the emergence of untouchables in Hindu society. In view of D.R. Ambedkar, the transformation of society from primitive society to modern society is the main causes of untouchables who lived outside the village. Primitive society consisted of nomadic society, while modern society consists of settled communities. Primitive society consists of tribal communities based on blood relationship, while modern society consists of local communities based on territorial affiliations. Therefore, primitive society became to a territorial community from a tribal community and from a nomadic to a settled community. The primitive society was cattle society, and the primitive society was migratory because wealth like cattle was migratory. The cattle had to move always from place to another place, and the primitive people became settled community. So, primitive society was always changeable. Ambedkar has stated that all types of primitive community could not settle at one place at one time. The people of the primitive society were divided into two categories, that is settled and nomadic. According to Ambedkar, when the Aryan society was passing from a nomadic life to a settled community, the Aryan society became into two groups, namely settled tribes and the broken man. The settled tribe founded the village and formed a village community, and nomadic broken man founded a separate group and lived in separate quarters outside the village. The Hindu Shastras recognize the terms Antya, Antyaja and Antyavasin. The Hindu scriptures argued that the Antya means one who was born end and Antaja means an untouchable. The Hindu Shastras believes that the Shudras were born last. The untouchable is outside the scheme of creations. The Shudras were Savarna and untouchables was Avarna, that is outside the Varna system. Dr. Ambedkar's view was that the term Antya does not mean creation of the last and the last of the village. The word Antya was a name, and those who were lived on the outskirts of the village called Antya and Antaja. The broken men were Buddhist. The Brahmins disliked the broken men. The broken men embraced Buddhism and shunned the Brahmins because they were the opponents of Hinduism. Earlier, Brahmins and non-Brahmins both ate flesh and beef. Animal sacrifice was as religious rite for all Hindus. The beef eating was common to both the settled tribes and broken men. The settled community ate fresh meat and the broken men ate the flesh of the dead cow. The Brahmin left beef eating and started cow worship. The dead cow skin, bone, flesh, etc. were the economic resources of the untouchables. They have continued the habit of beef eating against the will of Brahmins. The untouchables were broken man belonged to the Mahar community. The Mahar community is a principal untouchable community in Maharashtra. Every village in Maharashtra was a wall, and they had separate quarters outside the wall. They were appointed as watch and ward on behalf of the village. Yajnavalkya Srimati says that slavery is in the descending order of the Varnas and not in the ascending order. Manu in his Manusmriti says that a Brahmin shall never beg from a Shudras. Property for performing a sacrifice, that is for religious purposes. Now we will understand the viewpoints of the sociologist on untouchability. Among sociologists broadly, there are three different viewpoints existed. The first one is the consensus view. According to Louis Dumont and Michel Moffat, untouchables are the integral part of Indian society. Their view is also called as unity model. They view that even the untouchables shares the Brahmin ideology. Chamars and Bangis who were untouchables, but even Chamars does not touch a Bangi. Malas and Madigas both are oppressed section. Even among them, one feels superior than the other. So, even untouchables constitute an important part of Hindu society as Brahmins or other castes. But one thing to be noted here is that the social exclusion is extreme for the untouchables than any other Hindu. Even a menstruating woman is considered as an untouchable, but it is only temporary exclusion. Now, the conflicting view. Vereman Kathleen Gaw and Joanne Mancher say that Dumont fails to explain about caste and what for it existed. According to them, caste system was a system of political and economic dependence and dominance. Caste system guarantees differential access to valued things in life. For those who live in caste system, reality is different. Deprivation is perpetual and cumulative for the untouchables. Caste system is an oppressive system and they think untouchables are different. Caste system is not for unity but for disunity. The untouchables are the victims of exploitation and humiliation. Now, the diversity view. Oliver Mendelssohn and Marika Bixiani neither take the consensus view nor the conflict view. They took the diversity view, which highlights the contrast between the untouchables and the upper caste. They claim that untouchables are no different from caste Hindus and take into the very ideology of purity and pollution that stigmatize them. They say that untouchables, though part of the same society, it was suitably modified to suit the interest of the upper caste. Even the untouchables practice Hinduism. Since untouchability remains a part of the caste system, it cannot be eliminated unless caste system is destroyed. Dr. Ambedkar, an outstanding leader of the untouchables and he who himself experienced the untouchability by the upper caste Hindus during his lifetime, once said, "There will be outcasts as long as there are castes and nothing can emancipate the outcasts except the destruction of the caste system." The caste system cannot be destroyed in isolation because it has roots in the system of economic production. It forms as an integral aspect of the Indian production system in the predominantly rural India. So, an approach which embraces and observes both the dimensions of class and caste of the Indian society must be evolved. And only a movement which takes into consideration both class and caste aspects of the Indian socio-economic subculture and structure and which can mobilize the oppressed classes, including the oppressed caste, could have the potential to smash the inhuman practices of untouchability in today's India.